I want to start this video off with a quick story. Back in 2020, when I was stationed in Japan, an online friend of mine posted a link to Facebook. That being a song by Steely Dan called Your Gold Teeth 2. Now when I heard that name, Steely Dan, I was like, oh, I know of these guys, but I've never actually listened to any of their work. Maybe I'd heard Reelin' in the Years or Do It Again on the radio at some point, but that was about it. Truth be told, I always lumped them in with a lot of the cheesy soft rock of the 70s, without actually giving them a chance. But, for whatever reason, I decided to click on the link and listen to the song my friend posted. And let me tell you, from that moment, I was converted. Crazy time signature changes in the intro, the playful swing of the verses, the effortlessly smooth vocals, and a surprising level of complexity in the songwriting. Needless to say, I was hyped as hell. At this point, I needed to listen to Steely Dan's entire catalog and see what I was missing all this time. So today, I'll be talking about my own personal take on each era of the Dan, as well as how they evolved over the years. Let's get into it. Steely Dan, the dynamic jazz rock duo of Donald Fagen and Walter Becker. Rest in peace to the latter. Throughout their 9-album run, one thing has never changed: their love of jazz. Every record of theirs had at least some association with jazz music, from the light Latin touches of the group's debut album Can't Buy a Thrill, to the sophisticated yacht rock of their landmark record Asia. But as the band's career progressed, their work became increasingly more complex and fusion-oriented with each passing album. So how exactly did this evolution come about, and what did it yield? Well, first of all, it's worth noting that for the band's first 3 records, they were a band and not just a duo. Sure, Fagen and Becker wrote most of the material and served as the band leaders, but there was still a full lineup rounding things out. And if you're a classic rock nerd like I am, you'll probably recognize quite a few of these names, as many of them have become legends in their own right. You've got Skunk Baxter, who's played guitar for everyone from the Doobie Brothers to Joni Mitchell to Donna Summer. Then there's the co-founding guitarist Denny Diaz, who would go on to work with such household names as Toto and Wayne Shorter. Can't Buy a Thrill, Countdown to Ecstasy, and Pretzel Logic all have their own distinct takes on the jazz rock sound. So let's go over them individually. Can't Buy a Thrill, while perhaps being the least jazzy record in Steely Dan's catalog, still has plenty of hints of what they'd eventually become. From the aforementioned Latin tinges of Do It Again, to the wild abandon of Elliott Randall's iconic guitar solo on Reelin' in the Years, to the idiosyncratic piano stabs of Fire in the Hole, it's clear that even this incarnation of Steely Dan was different from their direct contemporaries. However, the next 2 records, Countdown to Ecstasy and Pretzel Logic, marked the moment that I truly believe they began coming into their own. The musicianship was tighter, the song structures were more adventurous, and our songwriting duo became more dedicated to the jazz elements of their sound. Just listen to the wild keyboard improvisations of the excellent Your Gold Teeth, or the trippy chord changes found in the bridge of Parker's band. Oh yeah, and Pretzel Logic would be the band's first record to feature, some little-known drummer by the name of Jeff Porcaro. Well, I'm sure he won't do much else after this album. With that said, the fact that these early records were recorded with a full lineup does make them stand out from their later records. Don't get me wrong, Fagen and Becker were still perfectionists in this early stage. In fact, to them, Can't Buy a Thrill and Countdown to Ecstasy were both rushed, which, wow. If that's what they call rushed, then that's a real testament to their standards of quality. But anyway, I think the group dynamic of their early work has its pros and cons. For one thing, there's something more organic about the way these guys played off each other as a tight-knit unit. On the other hand, I feel as though this incarnation of the band lacked some of the songwriting and production polish that we would get with future releases. And with that said, I think it's time to get to... "1975, Katie Lied," the big turning point for Steely Dan as far as I'm concerned. The moment they stopped touring, whittled the lineup down to just the core duo, and focused more on being studio lab rats. In other words, minus the duo part, this was basically their version of what the Beatles had done post-Revolver. More focus was dedicated to high-end production values and sophisticated songwriting, while the studio as an instrument philosophy was starting to become more prevalent in their work. And if albums like Katie Lied and 1976's The Royal Scam are any indication, this approach would pay off in dividends. To be clear, this is still stylistically the same Steely Dan that we heard on those first few albums. However, their work had become much more refined and polished, and now that Fagen and Becker were just a duo, they had more freedom to experiment with their sound as they saw fit. The biggest shift, of course, was the ever-increasing number of session musicians. To be clear, Steely Dan had always used outside help, even dating back to the Camp by a Thrill days. But from Katy Lied onward, each album would feature a revolving cast of different musicians to match or facilitate the style of each song. And while this isn't such a revolutionary idea now, as many modern musicians have a cavalcade of session musicians helping them out in the studio, the way Fagen and Becker went about this ensured that each song was its own unique experience. Want to make an awesome funk rock jam like Kid Charlemagne? Just bring in Larry Carlton to provide an incredible guitar lead. Want to add a little more flavor to the introspective, melancholic jazz rock of Dr. Wu? Well, the wailing saxophone of Phil Woods should do the trick. This approach basically ensured that Fagen and Becker could assemble a dream team for every song they wrote, which is a level of freedom most musicians only wish they could have. And of course, this brings me to what I still consider to be the duo's crowning achievement, their 1977 masterpiece, Asia. Today, Asia has garnered a near mythical reputation in the rock world, and it's completely earned. The songs became longer and more complex, but not to the point that they were overbearing or pretentious. The lyrics became more thoughtful and contemplative, but not to the point that they abandoned the strange character portraits the band were known for. The production is absolutely immaculate, but not to the point that it sounds artificial or soulless. The way I see it, Asia was the perfect balance of what came before and after it in the Steely Dan catalog. On top of this, the duo had trimmed all of their songwriting fat at this point. 7 songs, 40 minutes, all killer, no filler. And even the album's more lengthy excursions, such as the proggy jazz fusion of the title track, or the sprawling balladry of Deacon Blues, don't waste a single minute of their runtime. With that said, the shorter cuts are just as impressive. Black Cow is an incredible way to open an album, armed with a slick funk groove and killer horn lines. Meanwhile, Peg and Josie see Fagen and Becker adopting a bluesier approach to craft some of the biggest hits of their career. And to round things out, Home at Last and I Got the News proved to be underrated deep cuts, the former anchored by drummer Bernard Purdie's famous Purdie Shuffle, and the latter a jaunty tune with quirky piano parts and nimble bass lines. Asia struck an amazing balance between accessibility, artistry, and diversity that, as far as I'm concerned, the duo would never reach again anywhere else in their catalog. Still, you may be noticing a few themes throughout this video. Words like immaculate, polished, perfectionism, and so on. Unfortunately, while Fagen and Becker's perfectionist tendencies led to some of the best material in their discography, it would also prove to be a double-edged sword. So let's talk about that, shall we? Conventional wisdom has long held that Gaucho is the demarcation line of the duo's career, the moment that their perfectionism became a liability, and when things really started to fall apart, culminating in their long break from recording and touring. Me personally, I'm a bit split when it comes to that notion. On one hand, I totally understand why that opinion is so common. The recording of Gaucho was fraught with tension, the process taking over a year, the title track's drum parts being composed of 46 different takes that were spliced together. Only 40 seconds of Mark Knopfler's literal hours of guitar solo takes being used for Time Out of Mind. The list goes on. Exacerbating all of this was Becker's increasing drug use, not to mention a car-related injury that would leave him out of the studio for half a year. On the other hand, I need to clarify that I still enjoy Gaucho a lot. While I don't think the record is perfect by any means, it still features some of my favorite late-stage Steely Dan tunes. The title track and Babylon Sisters immediately come to mind. However, the album definitely is different from the records that came before it. The instrumentation is much more stripped down, the production is even glossier, and there's a strange, for lack of a better word, emptiness about it. Songs like Glamour Profession and Time Out of Mind almost have an uncanny valley quality about them, due to their overall minimalism and artificial vibe. But that's also part of Gaucho's charm to an extent, and it still yielded some decent hit singles, most notably the upbeat Hey 19. Still, the album didn't do much to stop the band's collapse. In 1981, following Gaucho's release and the aforementioned inter-duo tensions, Fagen and Becker decided to break up. Of course, that doesn't mean they stopped playing music altogether, as both members embarked on solo careers and collaborated with other musicians on the side. Highlights from this era include Fagen's absolutely fantastic solo debut, The Nightfly, as well as Becker's involvement in the 1985 China Crisis album, Flaunt the Imperfection. But finally, in 1993, Steely Dan decided to reform and play shows again. And this takes us to 1997, in which the duo decided to start recording their first album in 20 years, and one that would prove to be a bit controversial. When Two Against Nature came out in 2000, it was a resounding success. It charted at number 6 on the Billboard 200, sold over 1 million copies, and won 4 Grammy Awards. But there's one Grammy we really need to talk about, because that's the one that landed them in hot water at the time. Best Album. It may not initially seem crazy for them to win that award. After all, they were a highly respected legacy act who put out a really solid comeback. But let's just say that narrative changes once you know what else was nominated that year. Most notably, the Marshall Mathers LP by Eminem and Kid A by Radiohead. Two of the most beloved albums of the early 2000s, as well as two indicators of where popular music would go in the coming years. Needless to say, the younger listeners were not having it. There was a lot of resentment towards Steely Dan after that ceremony, resentment that hasn't fully gone away even today. But okay. For a moment, I want you to clear all of that from your mind. When examining the album itself without any of that context, how does it actually hold up? Honestly, really well. I'm not necessarily going to say that Two Against Nature deserved to beat out Kid A, which happens to be my favorite Radiohead album, but I think it's a lot better than people remember. Getting back into the subject of Steely Dan's musical evolution, I consider this album to be one of their most sophisticated and fusion-oriented efforts alongside Asia, from the prominent Latin percussion of the title track, to the slinky subtle bass lines of Negative Girl, to the extremely complex chord changes during the solo of West of Hollywood. There's so much replay value to be found here. It's also nice to hear Becker take on a more prominent role on the guitar, playing on 7 out of the 9 tracks. His work is especially notable on West of Hollywood, where he really lets his lead guitar work shine as he rips through the upbeat jazz rock number. The success of Two Against Nature encouraged Fagen and Becker to record another album, and this would ultimately be their last before the latter's tragic passing. Everything Must Go, while probably my least favorite Dan record, is still a decent send-off for this legendary duo. Stylistically, it largely follows in the same vein as Two Against Nature, but it's more relaxed and chilled out than its predecessor. The music is still performed as tightly as ever, and the production is still fantastic, but I get the sense that the sessions weren't quite as tense as on prior Steely Dan records. Unfortunately, this also means the music isn't quite as ambitious either, as there aren't really any surefire classics on this one. Still, as far as highlights go, I would recommend the delightfully cynical Godwhacker, or the lovely horn arrangements of the title track. Sadly, as I alluded to earlier, Becker is no longer with us. He passed away of esophageal cancer in 2017 at the age of 67, leaving an incredible musical legacy behind. Fagen still tours under the Steely Dan name to this day, but has never stated any intentions of recording more new studio material. Honestly, given how inseparable Fagen and Becker were as a duo, that's probably for the best. I wouldn't want a new Steely Dan record without Becker's involvement. Even in the mere 2 years that I've been listening to these guys, I already feel like I've been enjoying their work my entire life. To that online friend I mentioned in my intro, thank you for posting that link in the first place. Without that one little post, maybe I would have never gone down this incredible rabbit hole and discovered one of the best rock discogs of the 70s. And for those of you who haven't heard Steely Dan yet, trust me, checking out their catalog is absolutely worth it. This is just fantastic music, no matter what generation you're a part of or what musical taste you have. Long live Steely Dan. Hey everyone, just wanted to thank you for making it this far. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm planning on doing a lot more of these video essays in the future, so stay tuned. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Bye.